Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to be talking about one of the most common elements that I work with, iron. Iron, also known as ferrum by our Latin friends, that's where we get the chemical symbol Fe for iron, is number 26 on the periodic table of elements. It is a transition metal, and it is probably one of the most common metals that's on our Earth. It is more common than copper, which is how we ended up going from the Copper Age to the Iron Age. However, because of its high melting temperature of 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit, otherwise known as 1538 Celsius, it did make it a little bit difficult to work in the beginning. Copper is much easier to extract than iron, as copper is found more in its native form than iron is. However, iron is much more common even in its ore state. So after a while of extracting copper, making bronze and stuff like that, some people started finding iron ores and started working that instead by reducing it through carbothermic reduction. Pretty much just burning coal. When they burnt this coal, they were able to pound out some of the impurities. The oxides would come off as carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide out of their furnaces, and eventually they would get stuck with something that was mostly pure iron. And that's how we ended up getting some of the first iron implements. Before that, there was some use of meteoric iron, but that was mainly mixed with things like nickel, which we'll talk about in a different video. It's actually interesting because most of the iron that was around back then wasn't even cast. Cast iron is actually relatively recent in the scope of history. Iron casting started in China around the 5th century AD, I believe. And it continued there for quite a bit. It didn't actually make it to medieval Europe until, well, it didn't really make it into medieval Europe. It made it into post-Renaissance Europe, sometime around the 1700s with the Industrial Revolution. They started making blast furnaces that could melt iron and melt it at a cheap and somewhat efficient rate. And so eventually we got cast iron, which allowed for construction of iron bridges and buildings much more effectively, thus forever changing the face of cities, industries, and several other things in our daily lives. Now, just about everything around you is made up of iron. Even you are made up of iron in some respects. The common human body contains about 4 grams of iron, which is a visible amount of iron. Considering it's not, carbon, hydrogen, or oxygen, that's quite a bit. It's one of the more common elements in the human body, I believe. So, anyway, with that, one of the things we make out of iron is railroad spikes. Now, this is not your common railroad spike. This is. I happen to stretch this one out quite a bit. And that is one of the more lovely properties of iron, is that it is ductile under the right conditions, but also super hard and super brittle under other conditions. It has several different crystalline forms, or rather several different crystal sizes, and depending on how you quench it or temper it or anneal it, it can go into either any one of them. It's all down to a science generally. The faster you cool it down, the harder it becomes. And without proper tempering, it becomes too brittle to work with. So there's always that balance, and it is kind of the fundamental underpinning of blacksmithing is proper heat treatment of your iron and iron alloys, also known as steel. So with that, it's time to show you some cool stuff with iron. About half of the videos that I've done on this channel have had to do with iron in some way or another. Me working with iron, with hammering it, grinding it, doing all sorts of things to iron. So you already have some pretty good examples of it. For instance, I could throw up a video now of me pounding away at some nice orange hot steel, or iron as the case may be, because let's be honest, these railroad spikes are just mostly iron anyway, and not a whole lot of carbon sometimes. But I'm going to show you guys just now another independent example of me grinding iron, because I have some right here that I just like to grind down a little bit. One of the really cool things about iron is that when you grind it, it is one of the few metals to be able to do this. See, it's shiny! And even though I just bragged about how shiny this isn't actually the special thing about iron. As you saw, the special thing is that it sparks like crazy. You don't get that with aluminum, you don't get that with copper. Unless I alloy iron into both of them by accident. But you do get that with iron, and so that's a good way of being able to tell whether something is ferrous material or not. Of course, there are other elements that spark, for instance, titanium, some of the lanthanides, I believe samarium sparks, but iron sparks in its nice, fun, little unique way. So, generally speaking, if it sparks with those nice, beautiful orange sparks that just kind of pop off at the ends, you're probably looking at iron. It's pretty safe to assume anyway, since for the most part we don't use those other metals very much. So anyway, with that, I hope you all enjoyed this nice informative video about iron, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.